All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 17, Section 3, Making a Living in Gold and Cattle. So let's recall that 17-1 and 17-2 talked mostly about farming in the West, which is what a lot of settlers went to the West to do. But there was also money to be made in gold and cattle, which were two also industries in the West that lured many settlers there. So looking first at gold, gold was probably the most popular in terms of what attracted the most people to the West, but not the most practical, because in fact, most people who went out West in search of gold ended up not finding any. This gold rush was spurred off in 1848 when gold was discovered in California. And this set off a mad rush for people to go to California, specifically Sacramento, Northern California, in search of gold. The people who went to California in search of gold were called 49ers. So these were the people who traveled west, talking about California, in search of gold. They're called 49ers because of the year they traveled, 1849. So gold discovered 1848. Before it was verified, 1 year later, pretty soon you have, thousands of people descending upon California looking for gold. Like I mentioned previously, most came up empty-handed. It was very rare for somebody actually to strike it rich, but it had the effect of moving a lot of people over to California. Instead, it was actually other minerals like silver and copper that proved to be more profitable in the long run. Silver especially. The Comstock lode is, I think, the largest, at least in the U.S., silver mine. And this was in Nevada. And to a certain degree, copper was a little bit less sexy than gold and silver, but this was especially useful for things like wire and wiring, especially with the advent of electricity. So whether it was gold, silver, copper, whatever it was, there was a lot of mineral wealth that could be found. Now, typically, when the gold rush first started off, it was individual prospectors panning for gold, right? So you see this image right here. This is very much the type of gold mining that might have taken place in 1848, 1849, et cetera, et cetera. However, as time went on, and especially with the advent of big business and railroads, gold mining, silver mining, and copper mining became a much more corporate enterprise rather than individual prospectors. So big business really became involved. And typically, if somebody were to strike it rich, searching for gold, it was by discovering it and then selling the land to a corporation, which then would take investment capital, which is, money from investors, people like J.P. Morgan, and bring in heavy machinery, which could mine more efficiently. Like, big hydro-powered drills, dynamite to blow up the mountains, and then be able to extract whatever mineral wealth could be found via, railroads and other things like that. And so what that required then was instead miners to work in very dangerous working conditions. In fact, death rates were very high in the mines. I think mine workers or miners, I think that was the highest death rate in the United States at this particular period. Maybe even more so than factory workers and railroad workers, which was also a very dangerous enterprise as well. And the discovery of gold could lead to towns essentially popping up overnight. We called these boom towns. So a boom town was essentially a town that was created overnight due to the discovery of gold, silver, or copper. However, once all those minerals were, extracted, those towns evacuated, right? So we use this term ghost towns to describe former mining towns that become abandoned. And, this type of, finding mineral wealth, a bunch of people rushing into one place, big businesses coming in with the machinery and railroads. And, once all the wealth was extracted, that, those towns just sort of disappearing. This all contributed to what we might refer to as the Wild West, is that there was a certain sense of lawlessness, right? There wasn't sort of a firm, proper structure or order going here, and things often were very, very messy out west. So mining was certainly one, and it wasn't just gold, but silver and copper as well. Another very profitable industry that emerged in the West was what we call the cattle kingdom. This would be, meat and stuff like that associated with cattle products. You had many longhorn cattle in Texas. And previously, really before the railroad, there was no reliable way of getting cattle products to, cities like New York, cities like Chicago. Railroads really made the cattle business possible, right? Possible. And ranchers teamed up with big business who would provide investments to use or create what were called cattle drives. And cattle drives were, driving or maybe guiding cattle from Texas to Kansas. Kansas was where the railroad was. And then those would bring that to the city, right? And that's more or less how the cattle industry emerged. So, again, driving from Texas to Kansas, a cattle drive would look something like this, where you'd have, a cowboy on horse, and they would be directing this, this massive kind of, herd of cattle here over hundreds of miles. Once reaching Kansas, those cattle would be put on the railroad. Then they would be sent to the cities, and that would, that created really the modern cattle industry. The individuals who, made this drive possible were cowboys. Again, these are people who work in the cattle industry. Also became a very much of a romanticized symbol of the West. A lot in American culture is based off the cowboy. The reality for cowboys was that it was a very difficult life. There's a certain, media, literature, poetry, and later on movies and TV shows romanticize. And what romanticize means is kind of like only emphasize the good aspects of it. But the reality was that, life as a cowboy was incredibly tough. It was lonely. It was low paying. It was long days. It was uncomfortable. A lot of the culture that American cowboys use actually came from Mexican ranchers. This territory before Texas in 1848 and before that had been Mexico, right? And it only after that had become the United States. And so a lot of the ranching industry that was there before 1848 was really put together by Mexican ranchers. So we might say influenced the American cowboy in terms of, culture and tactics, or whatever you call it, dress, attire, etc., etc. However, these cattle drives came to an end with the invention of barbed wire. This is a picture of the invention of barbed wire here. If you're not entirely familiar with what barbed wire is, it is fencing that has, very kind of spiky and it's not fun to touch. It was primarily used to ensure that cattle sort of stay in their own area. Barbed wire was used to fence off land, and it disrupted cattle drives. Right, think here about these cattle drives that went from, Texas. Maybe let's use a different color so we can actually see what's going on here. The cattle drives that went from Texas to Kansas. Well, once you create all these different obstacles with people fencing off their land with barbed wire more or less killed that industry. And so as a result of barbed wire, cattle drives were essentially killed off. And instead, you have strictly a big business type of livestock industry emerge as a result of that. So in addition to farming, mining was big. The cattle industry was also another big part of the Western economy. Now, like we mentioned before, the West has a certain romanticized perspective to it, right? You know, the idea is that the West is all about gambling and gunfights, and you know, there is a certain reality to that, but there's also a lot of the West that is a myth, right? So that's like not entirely true to what is portrayed in culture. Okay. So the myth of the West. There's a tendency to exaggerate and glorify the violence. People like Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday became somewhat mythical figures. You know, they participated in various shootouts, and they became somewhat of legend in sort of American lore. However, it was a pretty violent place in the West. You know, there wasn't a lot of the structures there that were necessary to maintain law and order. There were a lot of times no policemen, no jails, no courthouses, no, you know, territories in which there was no legislation or laws on the books. So when you combine the, you know, many young men, money, liquor, disappointment, this is a recipe for violence, right? A recipe for violence. Because there was no lawlessness, there was frontier justice. We might say this is people taking the law into their own hands, right? You know, the idea is that whoever claims themselves to be the sheriff and just puts the badge on essentially gets to determine what the law and order is in that society. The murder rates in the West were much higher than other places in the United States. And this was also true in the ranching industry. So for example, with the advent of barbed wire and the killing of you know, cattle drives, this led to competition and outright violence between various ranchers. The fence cutting war was a violent clash between ranchers, you know, being threatened by not being able to continue their, you know, their cattle business. However, you know, slowly, lawlessness did get a taste of law. Some of this had to do with the sex ratio, that is the amount of men to women, right? As more women arrived, there was, you know, more institutions. So you had more churches, schools, and cracks down on various vices. You saw the United States pass a few laws. The Comstock Law, what we might call this, might be an anti-pornography law. So the mailing of any sort of lewd or obscene materials. The Page Act was an anti-prostitution law, which of course was very much rampant in the West. But this, you know, transformation from lawlessness to a more orderly society in the West, you know, it took time. All right, it took time. It didn't happen overnight.